Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to see so many faces in one room together. It's been a long time since we've experienced this here. So thank you so much for being part of this welcome back and return to campus life. My name is Hira Jafri, and I serve as the director of global programs at Yale University, as well as the founding co-director of the program on peace and development at Yale University, through which I conduct sort of various forms of research on cultural understanding, on education, and peace. Currently have a project on integrated education in Northern Ireland, among other things going on. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our conference on lessons from peace, Northern Ireland and Colombia. This conference has been months in the making and marks two momentous occasions. It's the first in-person event hosted on campus by the Program on Peace and Development, which was born in the midst of COVID lockdown protocols, as well as the inaugural event of a joint initiative between the Program on Peace and Development at Yale, the International Leadership Center at Yale, Intermediate, the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice at Queen's University, Belfast, and Professor William Weir at Harvard University. We are grateful to the Edward J. and Dorothy Clark Kempf Memorial Fund for their generosity in supporting today's event. We are here to celebrate and reflect on remarkable histories, noteworthy conversations, tremendous willpower, and incredible hope. We've seen neighbors band together to triumph through adversity, build a better community, and work tirelessly to unite people. Between Northern Ireland and Colombia, there are boundless lessons learned, success to celebrate, challenges to explore, and much to share. The group of scholars, practitioners, leaders, and luminaries we have brought together today are among the most knowledgeable regarding these cases and represent multiple stages of the peace process. We hope for the information we share today and the discussions held to serve as a launch pad for larger conversations on what can be learned from each process and how we can support each other in a global quest for peace and justice. I thank you all for joining us today, whether it's in person or online, and we're grateful for the ability to share this event with both communities. And I now pass it over to my co-director, Professor Bonnie Weir.
Thanks, Hira. My name is Bonnie Weir, and I'm the founding co-director of the Program on Peace and Development and co-organizer of this conference. I teach in the political science department, and my research deals with conflict and post-conflict politics, mostly in the context of Northern Ireland. This morning, I have the distinct honor of introducing our keynote speaker, Sergio Jaramillo Caro. Sergio Jaramillo, one could say, has a habit of perceiving and applying lessons from processes of peace across the globe. When I first spoke with him about the idea for today's conference, for instance, he'd already been thinking seriously about how these processes in Colombia and Northern Ireland relate to each other and what we can learn from them. Perhaps this is a feature of his global education. Sergio studied philosophy and Greek at the universities of Toronto, Oxford, Cambridge, and Heidelberg. And it is certainly consistent with the extraordinary peace process that he led in his native Colombia. Toward the beginning of his career of government service, Sergio Jaramillo worked as advisor to the Ministers of Foreign Affairs and Defense, and he went on to be executive director of Ideas for the Peace Foundation in Bogota, before serving as Vice Minister of Defense for Policy and International Affairs. In 2010, Mr. Jaramillo became National Security Advisor to the President of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos. He then served as High Commissioner for Peace, and in that capacity, he led the secret negotiations with the FARC guerrillas, which produced the General Agreement of 2012. He then led the 4-year-long public negotiations process, along with Humberto de la Calle, which ended with the signing of the landmark final agreement in November of 2016. As Peace Commissioner, commissioner, he also oversaw the disarmament of the FARC in 2017. He was then appointed Colombia's ambassador to the EU and Belgium. Currently, Ambassador Jaramillo is a senior advisor at the European Institute of Peace. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Ambassador Sergio Jaramillo Caro.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Bonnie, for those very kind words, and many thanks to you, to Hira, to Emma, to Yale for this invitation. I'm really so happy to be here and to be here amongst so many friends. I'm happy to see a small Colombian invasion of Yale, beginning with Eduardo Cifuentes, the president of the Special Tribunal of the HEP in Colombia. We're very honored to have you here, Eduardo. None of you know, and he will tell you, but there's an extraordinarily important event audience of the HEP happening, I think, today and tomorrow, which to me, I was talking to some friends from the law school last night, and they couldn't believe that this was actually happening in Colombia. A general going before the tribunal and acknowledging that he had committed by omission war crimes. So thank you very much for coming and for taking the time, Eduardo. It's extraordinarily important to us. And many thanks to all the nominal Colombians who are here. Carlos Ruiz Macio, the head of the verification mission, who also took the time, and many others, Jessica, Libby, we all consider you to be Colombians. It is actually true that I have been discussing in Brussels with a friend, with Eamon Gilmore, who was the EU's special envoy to Colombia, the idea of doing something in Brussels about the Northern Ireland peace process and Colombia. And there was actually, Richard English is here, there was an occasion organized by Queen's University and the University of Chicago a few years ago that did exactly that. But as always, I think it's good to come back and remind ourselves what we can learn. And I do think it makes a lot of sense to compare these two peace processes. First, because they are, I should think, the two biggest peace processes of the last 25 years. They ended decades, some of the oldest conflicts in the world. They produced hundreds, in the case of Colombia, millions of victims. And that both achieved at least the very basic thing that you want to do with the peace process, which is to put an end to political violence, to discredit the idea of political violence, and to show that the way forward is democracy. But for me, frankly, this is above all an occasion to express my gratitude to everything I've learned from the Northern Ireland peace process, above all from Jonathan Powell, who's with us today, and who, I mean, none of you know, but may have heard, but Jonathan actually was like a guardian angel of our negotiation, would on call any moment get on a plane from London and descend and be with us and spend hours and hours in very difficult meetings. And this not over weeks or months, but over years, because the negotiation of Colombia was extremely long. So really we cannot, we don't have a way of paying back Jonathan for everything he did for Colombia. Eternal gratitude from all of us, and for me in particular, from whom I've learned also huge amounts, but from dozens of others as well, who had to do with Northern Ireland. And I think that this is a good example, just as many people in Northern Ireland learned from the South African process in the 90s. We learned from many other places as well, but I think particularly from Northern Ireland. Now, this idea of comparing the two processes, I think, has now acquired a new sense of urgency, because as we all know, a savage war of aggression has been raging in the Ukraine now for 2 months. And none of us want to sit back and simply watch. We want to employ all our wits to see how we can help. There are obviously massive differences between these two peace processes and what's happening in the Ukraine. In the case of Colombia, we're talking, as you know, obviously, or strictly an internal armed conflict. In the case of Northern Ireland, we had the issue of nationalities, allegiance to what state, but it was still within a polity, a community, whereas in the case of the Ukraine, we have the invasion of one country by another. But I think that still there are many things you can learn. I'm not optimistic that there are going to be negotiations, at least serious negotiations, in the Ukraine in the short term. It may be that all that can be done for the moment is to provide military support, but still, I've always thought that really the key to strategy is to anticipate, to try and think through and build structures that enable and shape outcomes. So I think the quicker one gets going, thinking about how this could be, the better, because negotiations are extraordinarily hard. This is one of my messages today, and I think you win if you prepare. I want to start by making what I'm going to call two pleas. The first is precisely a plea for the value of lessons learned. It's the standard thing to do is to start with a disclaimer and to say that each conflict is unique and that it's all about context. And that's not certainly the case. One thing I found advising peace negotiations, sometimes along with Jonathan, is that the one common thing they all have is that they all think they're unique. Everyone says, "Oh, yes, but our conflict is unique." And certainly, if you go back to what I always say is, in my view, the best line in Clausewitz, where he says that the greatest act of judgment of a general is to understand the war he's fighting and not to take it for what it's not. That is also true of peace. You have to understand the particular conflict, the particular situation, what makes it tick if you're actually going to come up with the right solution. But frankly, just like in war, it doesn't mean that you can actually not learn from others and not learn also, and especially in our case, from your own past mistakes. Because in the case of Colombia, we had actually 3 previous very serious and large negotiations that had failed. So the first thing you do is you learn from your own mistakes. The previous one, which is known in Colombia as Caguán, had included the then president, Andrés Pastrana, handing over a territory to the FARC the size of Switzerland as a demilitarized zone, which created all kinds of perverse incentives. So there you have a simple lesson. Don't hand over a territory the size of Switzerland to an insurgency if you're going to negotiate, or don't, as they also did then, create a massive group of friends of the peace process, 24 in our case, without knowing what you want these countries to do. But actually, more seriously, what I think is that in negotiations, inevitably, you get into analogous strategic situations where you can really stop. And if you use your judgment and look around, you can actually pick and take from others. And you don't have to get into great debates about learning from history or, as Kissinger, I think, once said, history is not a cookbook, because if things work, well, that's all you need. You need practical solutions to the problems you're facing. And you are going to face similar problems. For example, if you are doing, as we did, secret talks, and then these are going to become public, you are going to move to a different planet, and you need to understand what's going to happen then. And other people have gone through that. I remember reading a book by a Spanish negotiator who negotiated with ETA and went through exactly that. So it's, oh, okay, we need to really think about this, what's going to be different. Or the more obvious issue of you are negotiating with an insurgency that's going to give up its weapons, and so you actually have to produce some guarantees, because they, from their own point of view, are going to lose all their leverage. So how are you going to compensate for that so that they actually stay in the peace process? The so-called commitment problem. Or more generally, how do you create what I would call self-reinforcing structures of reciprocal behavior that move the process forward? You can actually learn a lot from what others have done. And I think this knowledge is worth collecting. And I understand that part of what is happening these days is a project between Yale, Jackson Macmillan, and Jonathan's organization to look precisely at that. And I celebrate that initiative. I will stick a little advert in, which is that in Colombia, we actually did something unusual, which is we created a virtual library of the peace process. And together with the Los Andes University and the Foundation of President Santos, we've actually put online most of the documentation, the timelines of the negotiations. Whoever's interested can actually go in and have a look. And my second plea is for what I want to call a strategic understanding of negotiations. And by that, I mean not understanding negotiations as is common and natural, as here are the negotiators, here are the diplomats, and there's the use of force, there's the military. Here are the doves, there are the hawks. I think that contrast and this idea that negotiations are something that happens afterwards is actually not very useful. First of all, precisely because people get into their minds this idea that you have to first see what happens in the battlefield and then see how you're going to negotiate. And that's not very useful, but especially because I think it clouds the fact that you're actually facing one problem, one war, and that you have to use all the instruments at your disposal so far as possible simultaneously to solve it. And in some cases, you may actually find that you have even more clout, if you like, at the negotiation table than you may have in the battlefield, as may be indeed the case with the Ukraine today. In this understanding of what I'm calling a strategic approach, I was myself much influenced by some lines in the famous Strategy of Conflict of Tom Schelling, who had a tangential but very nice appearance in our own negotiations. He went to a meeting we organized in New York in 2014 from Washington, for which I was extremely grateful. And there was this very important idea that of Schelling's, that behind any conflict, in the end, there's a mix of motives, and there are ways that lead to conflict, others that lead to cooperation, and that in the end, if you're in a bargaining situation, you have to understand negotiations as another tool. As you can think of, there's limited war, there's coercion, and there's negotiations, and you have to understand the whole thing as a whole. So in my view, what I'm proposing is the other side of the coin of what Schelling calls war as a bargaining process. So if war is a way of influence, sending signals, well, the negotiation is a way of doing the same thing from the other side. And as I just said, I think you can actually be, in some cases, as effective. In any case, my plea is to take negotiations seriously and to prepare as seriously as you would for a military campaign. And this is actually very, very rarely the case. With Jonathan, we had the privilege of advising the Afghan Republic in the negotiations in Doha very, very intensely over the last year. And I have to say that I was shocked to see, in the case of this country, the difference and the contrast between the massive military effort that was done in Afghanistan, the enormous amount of blood and treasure spent in that country, and the frankly improvised, unprepared negotiation performance that came afterwards. You say, but I mean, it can't be possible. I mean, surely you can actually think through this a bit more, you can prepare a bit more, especially, and even allowing for the fact, if you want, that was not in the end, especially not the Doha agreement, a proper negotiation, but frankly, a withdrawal agreement. You still need to think much better how these things relate, how they integrate, how they reinforce each other, what we're actually doing on the security front in the battlefield and at the negotiation table if you want to have success. And so we want to learn from that. And if this negotiation scenario should open in the Ukraine, we certainly do not want to repeat that mistake. Now, what I've done briefly is I've put together what I'm going to call a succinct kit of lessons learned, not an exhaustive list in any case, but just to sort of give some points to help frame the discussion of the things that I think are common to the negotiations in Colombia and Northern Ireland. Now, of course, let me start with a disclaimer that these were very, very different conflicts and very, very different negotiations. In the case of Northern Ireland, that you know far better than I do, it was mostly a political process, negotiations between parties facilitated by the British government, supported by the Irish Republic, to find some political understandings and formula for a society to move forward, and indirectly to put an end to paramilitary violence. Or at least formally, that's what it looked like from the outside. Whereas in the case of Colombia, we had direct talks between a government and the largest insurgency in the history of Latin America to put an end to what was the largest war, the oldest, one that produced the most victims in the history of Latin America. And of course, you can take any figure from Northern Ireland and multiply it by 100 and you get Colombia. Not just the size, but number of deaths, you can multiply by 100. Number of victims, actually it's more than 100, because in the case of Colombia it's 8 million. But I'm not sure that necessarily in terms of the intensity and difficulty of the conflict itself, ours was easier to solve. You all know how extraordinarily difficult it was to achieve the Good Friday Agreement and everything that happened afterwards. So what I'm going to do is not produce an exhaustive list, but to just raise through a number of items that I think one can concentrate in. So in my proposed kit, the first thing you need is a back channel. I remember hearing once David Trimble say that after the Sunningdale negotiations failed in the 70s, and there were some intra-party talks that also failed, that a friend of his told him, well, look, David, actually, I can write on the back of an envelope what the solution to this problem needs to be. And that, of course, he always remembered that when, whenever that was, 25 years later, they actually got an agreement. And it's the famous phrase that Jonathan cites often, I think it's of Seamus Mallon of Sunningdale for Slow Learners. And it's actually an interesting question, why things were not possible then, which were possible later. In the case of Colombia, I think that we had our own missed opportunities that we haven't actually looked at closely enough. For example, when we had our Constitutional Assembly and our new constitution in '91, whom, by the way, Eduardo Cifuentes was president of the Constitutional Court of Colombia. That moment when some of the smaller guerrillas demobilized, I often think that actually was the moment when we should have wrapped this up, but we didn't. And why not? Well, I think it's probably common to both conflicts that the FARC as well as the IRA needed to be first strategically defeated militarily, by which I mean they needed to understand that their plans were not going to come to fruition, that for the military, by military means, they were not going to achieve results. That, I think, was a necessary but not a sufficient condition. Context changed as well. Notoriously, in the case of Northern Ireland, the relations between the Republic of Ireland and the UK, the appearance of the EU, in our case, less important, but still very important, the change of relations with Venezuela, the rapprochement that happened in the region, the creation of organizations to bring together very different governments and regimes, that all helped a lot. But still, if you're a government and you've been dealing for so long with such a different conflict, you first need to understand actually what's going on. Is there a chance? Can you actually risk negotiations after so many failures? And to do that, you actually need back channels. You need to first develop understandings that then begin to emerge incrementally, which I also think, in my view, is similar. In our case, we had a back channel, not as long as it happened in Northern Ireland, but we had a back channel that actually was very similar to the one. It was so similar. He was a man, a businessman who was so similar to the case of Northern Ireland that I actually called him Brendan, as Brendan Duddy in Northern Ireland, because that's what he did. He was a kind of a small, minor businessman who had this peculiar relation with the FARC and who did a very good job of bringing messages back and forth. And not just that, but to help develop an understanding on both sides through this communication of where they were. And on that basis, we moved on to a secret phase of talks, which allowed us to have a much better understanding of where the FARC were, and through a framework agreement to lay a foundation for the negotiations. And all of this was possible because we had this back channel. Second item of the kit is you want to have a map to help shape the process. In Northern Ireland, and I need to say again, I'm certainly not an expert, but from what I remember, and this had actually had a big impact in our own process, after long, interesting, but unfruitful discussions chaired by Senator Mitchell, you produced the proposition on heads of agreement in January of 97. And I remember when we were thinking about how to organize our own talks, and here is an example of a direct use of lessons learned. I remember Jonathan telling us about that document and how that document helped to structure what then became, if I'm not mistaken, the strands of the Good Friday Agreement. And so we took that and we developed that into a larger, if you like, more robust structure that became our own, what we call the general agreement, the framework agreement that we signed in secret in Havana after almost 6 months of secret talks in August of 2012, that did exactly the same thing. Established an agenda, established an objective, and actually went further in establishing rules for how we would proceed later. It was more of an actual agreement than the heads of agreement, because this was between the government and the FARC, but very important rules that are the things that actually make peace processes work in the end. Like, for example, we are going to establish a system of joint communications, and we're not going to have each party, each side go out and give their own version of the negotiations and things like that, which in the end are what make things work. The third item in my kit is what I'm going to have, what I'm going to call a formula. This map should contain a formula that unlocks, this acts as a kind of lever that gives traction to how the process is going to work in the end. I think in the case of Northern Ireland, my impression was that it was the well-known principle of consent, which is in the heads of agreement and had a different version previously in the Downing Street Declaration, and came out of talks that had been going on before in Northern Ireland. In our case, was the fact that in the framework, we already established a clear relation between, if you want, the political outcomes and what was going to happen in the battlefield, by insisting that from the framework agreement, that implementation had to happen simultaneously on all fronts, meaning that as soon as we signed the final comprehensive agreement, FARC had to start disarming as we started implementing as a government the rest of the agreement. And in my view, that rule, plus the rule that there could not be political participation and participation in formal politics unless FARC had disarmed, those two related rules were in many ways what made the peace process in the end work, and actually got the FARC, against everyone's expectations, to disarm extremely quickly in 6 months in 2017 under supervision of a UN verification mission. headed by Carlos's predecessor, Jean Arnaud. Why? Because they knew that if they wanted to participate in electoral politics and run for Congress, they first need to disarm. And this was already built into the original framework. And if you think about some of the problems that they're going to deal with at some stage, if you're not a complete pessimist, which one can be with regard to the Ukraine, but if at some stage they come up with some settlement, then some of these issues will need to be dealt with, which were precisely the issues that, so far as I understand, made it so very difficult or impossible to implement the previous Minsk agreements, which was the understanding was, so what happens first? Do you move to the border or do we actually run the elections? What's the relation? What's the timeline? What's, as Jonathan used to say, what does the choreography look like that is actually going to make this possible? You actually need to think through that formula because that formula is what's going to give the process traction. Next item on the list is you need a story that supports and that flows out of this map on this formula. You need, as we say these days, a narrative. And this, I think, is actually a much bigger point than everyone talks about narratives these days. But in the case of a negotiation, I am actually a big believer in that very good phrase, which is attributed, I think, 100 years ago to J.P. Morgan, where he says, a man always has two reasons for doing something, a good reason, and then the real reason. So this is how it works with an insurgency. There is the mise en scène, there is the presentation, there is the good reason, and then there are the interests behind, and you have to deal with both of them at the same time. I'm not a cynic. I don't deny that the good reason is also a real reason. I'm sure in the case of Northern Ireland, it was also a real reason, the participation in politics. But you have to actually deal with both of them, and you have to build around them, as is well known, a story that works for both, that works for in our case, the insurgency, and for the government. And out of this framework agreement, we created a narrative, a story about the process, which was not just about the FARC, but it was about ending the conflict. It was about guaranteeing the non-repetition of the conflict, which is what Eduardo Cifuentes is trying to do with his tribunal, and what we were trying to do by agreeing to this very ambitious rural reform to integrate Colombia, to deal with the periphery of Colombia, to guarantee over time equal rights to Colombians, to get Colombians to participate in our own democracy. That is the Colombian problem. Very different, naturally, from the Northern Irish problem. And out of that grew a narrative where we said, well, this is what needs to happen in Colombia. This is what we need to do, and this is what the process is about. Next item on the list, you need, for a serious negotiation, you need dedicated teams over time, because negotiations are really, really hard. I won't comment much on the case of Northern Ireland, but from what I know, obviously had very professional people in the UK government, in London, in the Northern Ireland office, in Dublin, in the Department of Foreign Affairs, over time dedicated to dealing with this problem. By the way, some of my spies in the system tell me that part of the problem is that there are fewer and fewer of these people left inside the system to deal with the current problems now. And in our case, we had above all what's called the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace, my office, which was this extraordinarily competent team, which were the kind of special forces of the peace process, who actually did a lot of the heavy lifting, which doesn't take any credit from the frontline negotiators. But if you don't have a robust technical capacity like that, it's going to be much more difficult to make progress. Next item, you want to have what I'm going to call, only half jokingly, in your kit, you want to have a sandwich. And by a sandwich, I mean, you want to make sure that as you are progressing with your negotiation between the leadership of one side and the other, what people call an elite negotiation, you're also working on the bottom-up part of the negotiation and the peace process, and establishing structures to bring these two together, both During the negotiation, which we did with the help of the UN and the National University, we were in Havana. The negotiation was happening in Havana. Colombians were watching from afar, and we needed to connect. And so we organized these very complex conferences to guarantee participation. But frankly, much more important than that was the idea that actually peace was going to come afterwards. Peace was going to be something that had to be done by everyone on the ground, and not just to implement an agreement, but to actually, in many ways, especially in these peripheral areas of Colombia, redefine the relation between the Colombian state and these communities in a model which I called myself once, now quite some time ago, territorial peace, which was to say, actually, the protagonists of the peace process need to be the people. But for the people to be able to do this, they also need support from the top. And there is where you get, again, your sandwich. And this is actually happening in the real world, and Carlos can tell you about what I call the PEDETs, this regional development programs, which cover about 20% of Colombian territory in these peripheral areas, and where 220,000 people participated in meetings and building plans. Now, related to this participation is the extremely serious issue of victims. And here's perhaps where there may be the biggest difference between Colombia and Northern Ireland. Because in Colombia, it was impossible for us to do a negotiation that did not include victims. Not because we thought out of nowhere, we need to do this, but because there was already a very robust, very strong movement of victims. The government had already passed legislation that created the largest reparations program in the world for victims. And in that context, we could say to the FARC in the secret talks, unless we have a point on victims, this agreement has no legitimacy. There's no way we can do this. And I won't go into all the details, but this participation of the victims in the first place, which included the victims, as some of you may know, going to Havana. 60 victims came to Havana and giving their testimony to the negotiating table. Just as you're sitting there, you would have 10 victims talking, which was not just moving, but it really reminded everyone of why we were there. And then everything that flew out of this, the new institutions that were created, such as the Special Tribunal de Eduardo Cifuentes, is heading the Truth Commission and so forth. They really, together, created an apparatus and a momentum that in many ways is keeping the peace process alive today, and is leading to some extraordinary things that hadn't happened anywhere. As I mentioned at the beginning, as having a general stand before a tribunal and acknowledge that he's committed, at least by omission, war crimes in a very, very moving way. Or having, if you like, an insurgency agreeing to do the same thing in the case so far of kidnapping. Very quickly, because I only have a few minutes left, I shall run through my last three items. One obvious one, the next one, is that you need to build what I'm going to call a kind of international scaffolding. In the case of Northern Ireland, very, very complex, starting with the Anglo-Irish Agreement and the very robust participation of the US, obviously with Senator Mitchell, but I mean, you all know much more about this than I do. President Clinton, President Biden himself, a senator, everyone in there supporting all the commissions that were created. And we didn't create anything exactly like this, but we did actually think in a very targeted way about what we needed from the international community, and began with what I call a strategy of expanding circles. Cuba and Norway in the room providing support for the secret talks, then for the facilitation, and then adding layers as we needed them, whether it was asking the US to send a special envoy, Bernie Aronson, who did a great job, or the EU with Eamon Gilmore, or indeed the UN and going to the Security Council. And this ended up being massively important because you underrate all the problems that are going to happen. And I frankly don't think that our peace process would have quite survived if the current government that got elected on a platform of opposing the peace process would have continued doing it if people like Carlos Ruiz Massieu and the Reunification Mission and the Security Council had not been on top of the peace process, and the government had understood that that's actually not the way but forward, even if slowly. Second last item, you need a set of guarantees in your kit, and especially constitutional guarantees. And you need to think ahead about them. In the case of Northern Ireland, you had the discussion about changes to the Constitution of the Irish Republic. You had all the bills that were produced in Parliament. In our case, we actually knew that in order to give FARC enough guarantees to disarm, we needed to pass some really quite complex constitutional reforms to do things like create the institutions of justice and truth, transitional justice, in time for this to work, in order to guarantee that they could participate in politics. That actually needed in Colombia constitutional reform. So what we did is that we created this fast track mechanism, which itself was a constitutional reform, ahead of time, so that when the lines met, when the FARC was about to disarm, we could actually pass legislation in half the time. And this was constitutional. And again, these are the kind of things you need to think about ahead. If you read some of the declarations of President Zelensky, he will say, well, how can we do this? Because we actually need 2 legislatures to change any of these things. And I say, well, it'd be good if they could come up with mechanisms that if they ever get to that stage, things are not going to break down because they cannot move fast enough, and they need to have, and the Russians say, well, we need to sit here for another year waiting for you to do this or that. And finally, the biggest issue, for which I don't have time to discuss, which is you need a political strategy. The one thing that has always intrigued me about the similarity between Northern Ireland and Colombia is the fact these were negotiations that happened in democracies, and the enormous complexities of negotiating in a democracy. Ian Shapiro, who is not here with us today, with some others, wrote a brilliant article about 15 years ago, comparing Ireland, Northern Ireland, South Africa, and the Middle East, and concentrating precisely on this problem of negotiating in what he called a flawed democracy. Remember a phrase where he says, in these negotiations, what he calls the ancien regime is not an authoritarian regime that needs to change, it's a flawed democracy that needs to transition. In our case, our flaws were the ones I have just described, this incapacity of the Colombian government to guarantee the rights of their citizens in these regions, to pacify the country, to make democracy a living thing for large parts of the rural population. So when you do that in a democracy, you really have a massive challenge. And here, Northern Ireland and Britain had a big advantage over us, because the Good Friday Agreement was signed towards the very beginning of the term of Tony Blair. And Tony Blair and Jonathan and everyone was in office for the 10 years that it took to move from that agreement to St. Andrews and having everyone in. And we didn't have that luxury. 2 years after the signature of the agreement, a government that opposed the peace process was elected. And that was a big problem. But a far bigger problem was the fact that we actually faced what I think that, with the exception of Israel in the 1990s and Rabin, was frankly the most vicious opposition to a peace negotiation anywhere, which was the opposition of former President Uribe to the negotiations, which had massive political impact, notoriously to the fact that we ended up losing a referendum by 0.3% and had to renegotiate parts of the agreement. And this was all politics. It's so much politics that at the time, President Uribe's main argument was to say that this was an agreement of impunity and this needed to be changed. And 5 years later, sitting at home with the president of the Truth Commission, he said to him, well, Father Deru, why don't we think about doing a general amnesty and just forgetting about the whole thing? So it doesn't look like this is really his real motivation. Real motivation was a political one, because in a democracy, especially one like Colombia, issues around peace determine identities, determine political identities. And dealing with this is extraordinarily hard. President Santos did all he could. He had, as I said, fierce opposition, but I still think we probably could have done more. We tried, we had people, we had Jonathan brought Alistair Campbell down some stage to tell us how they'd done the referendum in Northern Ireland, and we learned from others. But in the end, it's a problem that really went to the very essence of Colombian politics, and one that we're living with still today. But I will end simply by saying that still we achieved something that was achieved as well in Northern Ireland, which is that the population, the Colombian people, as I think the people in Northern Ireland, ended up appropriating the agreement, making it theirs. So the agreement, whether it is well implemented or so-so or not much, in the case of Colombia, we're somewhere between the not much and so-so. Still, the agreement became a program for the future, which nobody disputes. We have elections in Colombia at the end of May, and at the moment, none of the many candidates are campaigning against the agreement, because everyone has realized it makes no sense, that this is actually what needs to be done, especially on things like rural reform. Everyone agrees this is what needs to happen. And I think that is, at least for us, a significant achievement, because as you all know, peace processes, they only start when you sign the agreement. That's when the negotiations are very hard, but what comes afterwards is much harder. Congratulations against Eduardo for everything you're doing, because in the end, peace processes never end. Thank you very much.